Good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock here in Copenhagen, 10 o'clock in Finland, and I would just like to welcome all of you on behalf of Medicon Valley Alliance. My name is David Muniz-Sepanik. I'm the head of business development and public affairs with Medicon Valley Alliance. I hope and truly believe that you will all enjoy today's well-attended webinar with the title, What Does It Mean to be ISO 13485 compliant, co-organized with our member company, Inocas Medical. And this is actually our second webinar this year. If you get inspired not only by the content of today's webinar, but also by the concept, and start to wonder if it would make sense for your company or organization to co-organize an inspirational webinar with Medicon Valley Alliance, feel free to reach out to me. You will find my contact info on our webpage, and it will also appear on the final goodbye slide after the presentation. If you have questions about Medicon Valley Alliance membership, how to join MVA networks, which employees of MVA member companies can do free of charge, give me a call, send me an email. I also strongly encourage you to visit our webpage event calendar, where you will find a number of hopefully interesting online and offline events organized either by Medicon Valley Alliance or by some of our member companies and partner organizations. And if you haven't signed up to Medicon Valley Alliance annual flagship event, the MVA annual meeting, which takes place on the 8th of November at Clarion Hotel, Copenhagen Airport. I strongly encourage you to do so, and you can sneak peek at the program and register directly from the program in the event calendar found online. A few practical remarks about today's webinar, our household rules. It's pretty much standard operating procedure, but as you can see here on the slide, you are automatically muted. You should use the chat for technical questions only, and then the Q&A for questions to our speaker. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation, and then be aware that this session is being recorded. I guess enough said on my part. I am not the reason why you tuned in today. So let's fasten our seatbelts and get started. And without further ado, over to Eva Lindroth from Inocas Medical, who will introduce you to Inocas, and to today's keynote speaker, Linda Kilber, who is, of course, the reason why you tuned in today. Eva, the floor, or in this case, the screen, is yours.
Thank you, David. So good morning to you all on my behalf. I'm very pleased to be able to join this event and wish you all warmly welcome too. So I'm Eva Lindroth, and I'm heading the marketing at Inocas Medical. And I could not resist but come and say a few words about us before we get to the actual topic. So shortly about Inocas. Thank you, Linda, for sharing the slide. At Inocas Medical, we specialize in medtech and healthcare digitalization. So Inocas has actually been providing professional medical technology services since 1994. And as you can see from the slide, yes, we are from Finland. Currently, we are strongly focused on the Nordics. We work with startups and growth companies, but have also large global companies as our customers. And we are a full service house, as you can see from the list there, which means that we can help you from the start. So from developing your idea all the way into making it into an actual product on the market, and also making sure that you comply with all the regulations and quality things out there. And our services scale based on your needs, so based on our customers' needs. So it can be, so maybe you need a single expert to help with the regulatory processes, or maybe you need a partner, a reliable partner to take the take care of the whole process, including the product design and manufacture and all of in that chain during the life cycle of the product. And we can help you on that. So maybe we can change the next slide, Linda. Okay. So we are part of Pare Group. So it has altogether more than 450 employees and net sales of over $65 million, and it's actually growing pretty well. So, and from here you can see we launched our new latest concept, Digious, this autumn. So Digious is all about driving and enabling the digital transformation in healthcare. And here we cooperate, for example, with our Swedish sister company, Cubist. So we have been, we are very experienced, having been around that many years, and with the vast amount of projects we have been doing. But I actually have the audacity to say that the current Innocas is also a very contemporary and innovative company, and always on top of the latest developments. For example, on the regulatory side, with our super quality and regulatory team we have. And Linda here is a great example of that team. So that is very shortly about Innocas. I'm not going to steal any more time from the actual topic. So please, Linda, go on. It's giving the word to you.
Thank you, Eva. You should now be able to see me also. So my name is Linda, as said, and I come from Innocas Medical from Finland, and I'm going to discuss today on the quality management systems, especially in medical devices, and then our old friend and dear enemy, the ISO 13485 quality management system standard. So let's start with a brief view of quality management systems in general. Then we are going to continue more deeply into the contents of ISO 13485 and what it actually then means to establish compliance with this standard. At the end, we are very shortly going to discuss the certification process on a very general manner, because of course that is something that is very particular to a particular situation. So without further ado, let's start with the question, what is quality management? A quality management system is a set of your company internal rules that describe the way you address a certain set of requirements. It describes the roles and responsibilities within your company, and especially related to quality management system, because now we are talking about the actual quality management system. It is only part of your overall quality management system, but in this case, a very important part. It introduces and includes your policies, procedures, work instructions, different kinds of forms and templates that relate to the quality management. These quality management requirements come from, first of all, your own need. Always remember that you have to use the system. So consider your own need and what, as a company and organization, what do you need to be successful? Of course, there's also these different national regulations that you probably must take into consideration, especially if you are a manufacturer in the field. There are also international and national guidance that you can take into consideration, and in some cases you also have to. And of course, there are different standards like ISO 9001, which talks about quality management systems in general, that suits for everyone, and then ISO 13485, which is particular to medical device field. I often hear, and customers often kind of are struggling a bit with the QMS because they think and feel that it inhibits innovation, increases the rigidity of design and development, because it makes it really slow, or it at least feels really slow to go forward, and it increases the cost. I won't lie, in the beginning, of course, that is what it's going to do, because it will take time to be able to establish and create and implement a quality management system that really works in your case and in your specific situation. So yes, it will slow you down. Yes, it will increase the control because of which it feels like the innovation can be a little bit affected. And of course, it will increase the costs as it requires resources that won't basically come back to you as income directly, or may potentially never will do that. However, a quality management system, when applied as it should be, it actually helps you to achieve consistency in your operations by helping you to design, develop, and manufacture products that are of consistent quality. And by providing this consistent quality, it actually increases your customer satisfaction and reduces your cost at the end. This also, the biggest reduction in cost is actually due to less need for rework and shorter time to market. And this is not just talk. I've actually have a lot of experience with working with customers that are at the very end of the development, and they think that they're ready. Like, okay, we have a product, we need to get it on the market. And they actually face up the certification process and have to realize that, okay, we are actually not getting on the market because we don't have the evidence. So they will maybe have to take another 6 months to just create the evidence, to create the documentation, to update that, to actually be compliant with the regulations, not the standard as such, but the regulations. So definitely, this is not something to overlook. And honestly, for medical device manufacturers, an ISO 355 compliant QMS is actually no more than is required by the authorities. It's actually a little bit less. As I said, we also just shortly discussed the other quality management system. So 355 is basically part of your overall management system. It is not interested in business, for example. So you have to think about all those processes in addition to 13.5, but make sure that the 13.5 has kind of a easily non-threshold interface with your overall system. Also, there are these other management system standards, including environmental and information security management system, which can be used, and they may help you to establish an overall system that is most suitable for your specific operational environment. And this environmental management system, of course, in nowadays, this is very trendy also, but also it can be very effective, especially if you are a manufacturer, like a physical manufacturer creating products. There is things to consider when it comes to scrap, when it comes to raw materials, and how you handle your materials. And of course, the information security is something that is also due to all issues with all the data is now digitalized and so on. So this is something that, for at least in Finland, healthcare organizations are actually requiring this from their suppliers, especially if the suppliers are providing with software only products, but also any products that somehow connect to the network within the healthcare facility. So definitely something that you might want to consider in addition to all other requirements. So what is ISO 13485 specifically? The title, Medical Devices Quality Management Systems Requirements for Regulatory Purposes, tells it all. It's an international standalone standard by the International Organization of Standardization, thus the prefix ISO. The latest version is from 2016, and it introduced multiple smallish additions to the previous version from 2003. Nothing major, but it did introduce, for example, this concept of medical device file and design and development files. This is nothing new in medical devices, as for example, in the EU already the directive had required you to provide technical documentation, which is basically a combination of the content of medical device file and design and development files as described in the standard. Also, for example, US FDA requires a technical documentation or technical files in the form of design history file. Then there are design master record and design history record. So basically all of this has already been there. Now it's just included in the actual standard as a separate notion. Standard ISO 345 is not mandatory. Standards in general are not something that you have to use. There are exceptions that we're going to go into later on, but in general, they are not mandatory. But it helps you to set up a quality management system that demonstrates the consistent design, development, production, storage, distribution, installation, servicing, final decommissioning, and or disposal of medical devices, whichever applies to your specific situation. ISO 13485 consists of 8 clauses that we are now going to go very shortly and quickly through. So clauses from 1 to 3 are pretty general to all ISO standards. So they are scope, normative references, and terms and definitions. Always when you are thinking about using your standard, always make sure that you have checked the scope. Make sure that it really applies to you, and check how it's intended to be used. Normative references list standards that are mandatory in order for you to actually show compliance with this specific standard. ISO 13485 only have one normative reference, and that is ISO 9000, and that is actually just for terminology. So basically, that's why I said that this is kind of a standalone standard. You don't really have to use any other standards to be certified against 13485. Then the terms and definitions. I cannot emphasize enough to go through these terms and definitions, and this is with every standard that you're using, and use these terms and definitions within this content as they are defined in the standards. It will help you in a long run, and it will take off a lot of burden and hassle during audits and any kind of certification processes and device approvals, to just refer to the terms as they are intended to be referred to. Otherwise, you will have to have kind of a company standard dictionary, and that will just make your life a lot harder than it should be. Clause 4 then begins the actual standard requirements, standard text, and it talks about the general requirements related to quality management system. It describes the expectations and general requirements, including documentation, for example, the quality manual, and then the medical device file that we already referred to previously. It also describes the requirements for the control of documents and records, which is the first procedure that you would have to create. Clause 5 talks about management responsibility. It actually describes requirements for management, including the commitment of the top management to the implementation and maintenance of the QMS, and the focus on customer and regulatory requirements. It also discusses the quality policy, the quality management system planning, and management reviews. Management reviews also need to be provided as a procedure. Then it discusses about responsibilities and authorities, which you have to establish in some kind of a matrix or similar structure, and internal communication. This particular clause was something that I really struggled for a long time in the beginning of my career. I couldn't understand why it's in the standard. I didn't understand the meaning of it. Of course, there is management reviews and such, but how do you show evidence of commitment of the top management? And it didn't actually take long to be in the business, in the field, to understand the true meaning. Without 100% committed management, you absolutely cannot be successful in quality management. It requires a lot of resources, and this is often overlooked. It actually does require a lot of resources and a lot of time and effort to get it working, and it's worth the resources, but it is of course something that the management also they need to acknowledge and understand. And I've seen, unfortunately, I've seen too many times the management not maybe being as committed, and that will create difficulty in the actual implementation and use of the system, and that will be challenging them. In this field, especially where there is no choice. So really internalize this commitment part, and it's really important from the 13485 and quality management and a medical devices point of view. So it's really important clause, one of the most important clauses in general in the standard. Then clause 6 talks about resource management. However, 34.5 is not interested in money. It's not interested in whether or not your company remains in the field, whether you have the appropriate monetary resources. However, it does cover, for example, personnel, infrastructure, work environment. It is interested in the fact whether or not you have enough people in your company to maintain the quality management system, to maintain the quality, to make sure that you are creating, for example, if you are doing it, creating safe and effective devices. It is interested in the infrastructure, which is especially important if you are a physical manufacturer, because then you will have a manufacturing plant with manufacturing lines, for example, and there is a lot of control that is required to manage those factories and those production lines. And it also discusses the work environment, which if you are a software developer or medical device software manufacturer, of course, work environment as such does not matter that much. But in case you are making devices that are supplied sterile or sterile form, for example, of course, for example, the contamination control within the work environment becomes a very important issue. Clause 7 is probably the most the clause that will cause the most work, especially if you do design, develop, and or manufacture your devices. It considers all the aspects of the supply chain of a medical device or a related service as applicable to your specific product. And it covers the overall device process from planning the actual product realization to the definition of product requirements, which are more or less on the high level, and then the actual design and development. Design and development includes design inputs, design outputs, design reviews, verification, validation, changes, design transfer, and so on. It also lists the requirements for the design and development files, which we discussed previously. Clause 7 talks about purchasing in case you do manufacture your devices, or in case you are a supplier manufacturing medical devices. The purchasing is a very important part. It includes, of course, components, sub-assemblies, and so on, but it also includes the actual purchasing of your some controlled process. For example, the manufacturing process. So as a legal manufacturer, not physically manufacturing your own products, you will have to show purchasing control over your suppliers, and this is a process that will describe then the control and how it's applied. Of course, it discusses about production, service provision, and then control of monitoring and measurement equipment, and this equipment is specifically for the intention to monitor and measure the compliance of the product with its requirements. Then we only have clause 8 left, measurement, analysis, and improvement. So clause 8 describes the requirements for collecting, for example, production, post-production feedback and complaint handling. Complaint is, of course, a special type of feedback, and this is what the authorities are most interested in, because complaint usually suggest or complaints always suggest some kind of non-conformity in your devices or accompanying documents, whether or not it is actually there. So, for example, FDA don't talk about feedback at all in general, but they really are interested in complaint files. Of course, within the EU, it's the same thing. You really have to, and any other market area, you have to take care of the complaint handling due to the fact that then you are also you have the responsibility to report any incidents or near incidents to the authorities. For medical device reporting, you have to establish a procedure that will cover all your market areas. So if you do go to EU, if you do go to US, if you do go some other markets, Japan, Australia, China, Russia, you always have to consider the specific procedures that are applied within that area. So you have to make sure that all these reporting aspects have been considered. Of course, clause talks about the internal audits that can be done by external parties that are not, of course, then the certification organizations, but some other, for example, consultants. They can also be done by your own resources within the company. It talks about monitoring and measurement of product and processes. This relates to your KPIs, for example. And then control of non-conforming products, either discovered before or after delivered to customer. It also requires you to analyze certain kind of data, and it includes a requirement to use statistical techniques in case everywhere that is possible, and the improvement of the QMS, including the corrective and preventive actions. So this is really concentrating on the continuous improvement after you first have established your system. They are conducted to ensure that the QMS remains effective and that the device consistently complies with its requirements. And in case it doesn't, this is the section that describes how you will manage these non-conforming products or non-conformities within your procedures. So why ISO 13485? This looked really scary, especially if you are not familiar with the standard or how you apply that. So why would you want to use this if it's not mandatory, especially? ISO 13485 alone is not sufficient to show compliance with national regulations. This is a generalized statement, but I'd say that 99% of the cases this is true. So even though if you use ISO 13485, you always have to do some kind of gap analysis between national requirements and the standard to ensure that all the national requirements have been fulfilled, because those are the ones that the authorities are, of course, most interested in. And this includes the medical device reporting, as said. So standard doesn't really, it requires you to have a procedure for reporting these incidents, but it doesn't really specify the process itself. It just refers to the regulations of your market areas, if such exist. However, ISO 13485 provides, of course, a well-established, formal, well-known, acknowledged, state-of-the-art basis for establishing an appropriate QMS. So why would you want to invent the wheel again? National regulations, national guidances, they don't usually define any requirements in detail. They don't really describe the procedure that you can use, or don't give any examples. So ISO 13485 helps you in that. Of course, you always have to do some kind of an analysis and investigation yourself to make sure that the process is working specifically in your situation, but it will give you a very good framework, and the actual framework is enough. Then it's the actual content that you need to think about more. So, for example, and depending on your markets, consider, for example, the medical device regulation, Article 10, Item 9. Article 10 is the general requirements for medical device manufacturers, and Item 9 talks about the quality management system. Similarly to IVD regulation, Article 10, Item 8. Within the US, we have a very well-known 21 CFR Part 820 that talks about the quality system requirements. So good manufacturing practice, basically, or part of the good manufacturing practice in the United States. And then, of course, depending on your markets, there are different authorities that will provide different regulations and requirements. So Therapeutic Goods Administration, TGA in Australia, PMDA in Japan, and Anvisa in Brazil. And then there was a reason I didn't mention, for example, Canada, which is a very large potential area in Northern America. So let's talk about the other requirements in addition to these regulations. So very shortly, visiting Medical Devices Single Audit Program, MDSAP. This program allows the conduct of a single regulatory audit of a medical device manufacturer's QMS that satisfies the requirements of multiple regulatory jurisdictions. So in case you are planning to go to US, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and or Japan, or into a couple of those, definitely you should consider the MDSAP. EU is unfortunately not yet a member of the MDSAP program, but we are kind of sitting there waiting, maybe taking part at some point. Basically, MDSAP is it's a quality management system requirement framework program. And it's basically just an ISO 13485 plus the added national specifics from these member countries. So by going through MD-Sub process, going through the MD-Sub certification, you are basically able to show compliance with the chosen countries, member countries of the MD-Sub program, because you are going to be audited against these requirements. As a note, in case you are thinking about going to Canada market, they actually require this as a mandatory requirement. So they state the manufacturers need to have an ISO 13485 compliant QMS that is certified under the MD-SAP. So you need an MD-SAP certificate to go on the market in Canada in case you are a manufacturer of medical devices of class 2, 3, or 4, which is of course the Canadian classification. So nothing to do with the EU classification, nothing to do with the US classification. This is specific to Canada. And in case you are creating manufacturing devices, you are the legal manufacturer of devices of class 2, 3, or 4, you have to have an MD-Sub certificate to enter the Canadian market. And just as a kind of a not a warning, but just for you to note, even though the requirements are nothing new, this is something that you do have to comply anyway. The actual program is more challenging than ISO 13485 certification, which is quite informal from this point of view. MD-SAP correction timelines, for example, are a lot shorter. All the member countries that you are trying to get in will get the report of any non-conformities, and there will always be non-conformities, any of those non-conformities that the auditors find, and so on. So do not get into this process without being sure that you will be able to manage it. There's always going to be non-conformities, as I said, but in case you get to the two-number sum of non-conformities, it starts to get really difficult to be able to correct them within the given timeline. So just a point, but this is a very interesting program, and you should definitely follow this and study this in case these markets are something that you are considering. Okay, then with the quality management system of 13485, definitely, especially if you are a manufacturer or design and develop something, medical devices to a legal manufacturer, so as a supplier subcontractor, definitely consider additional standards within the quality management system, and this case especially within your design and development part, or the product realization part of the process, or the system, sorry. Think about or go through ISO 14971 from 2019. This is the newest version, and it's definitely something you should use. Forget the old version already. This will describe the risk management, everything you need to know about medical device risk management. It does have a little deviation from, for example, EU regulations that you will figure out, but make sure that you go both. But this is definitely the framework that will help you. Also consider 6234661 from IEC on usability engineering of medical devices. Usability within the medical device field is something different that usability is usually understood to be. So make sure that you understand the requirements. US actually do require, at least most of the times, they do require some usability documentation as part of the submissions you make. And in the EU, even though the usability as a word has not been mentioned in the regulation, it is something that you will need in order to show compliance with the general safety and performance requirements. In case you have software within your device, so embedded or firmware, for example, or in case you are providing a standalone software, definitely consider 62304 with respect to your design and development process. And in case you are a standalone software provider, then also consider 823041, which is now under harmonization also against the MDR. These will frame your design and development process when it comes to software and medical device software systems. In addition, in case you are making medical electrical equipment, so anything electronic or even just pure mechanics, consider the 60601 series. There's a huge amount of standards. They will affect your design and development process, especially from, of course, the actual design of your PCBs and layouts, but also the verification. And because of that, they will affect the schedules of your project. So even though they do not really provide specific requirements from process point of view, they will affect your processes. So it's important that when you are planning your system, you also consider these aspects. Okay, so how to achieve the compliance that we talk about? Start with defining the scope of your quality management system. You should always consider, first of all, your role in the supply chain. Are you the legal manufacturer? So you're the one whose name appear on the product, the one who is responsible for everything related to the product from regulatory point of view. Are you a distributor? Are you an authorized representative, importer, supplier, subcontractor, and so on? So it's a bit different. The emphasis of the standard is a bit different depending on your role. Of course, consider the devices and technologies that are subjected to the QMS. Do you have multiple different kinds of devices? Do you only do medical electrical equipment? Do you only do software? It will affect the overall content, and also especially the standards that you are going to use, or you can use to actually build the, for example, the design and development process. Also think about the applicability of different clauses to the standard to your devices and technologies. So in case you only do software products, or in case you don't do implantable or sterile devices, of course the related the requirements specific to implantable devices or sterile devices do not apply to you. If you only make software devices, of course the infrastructure requirements are less important than in case you make, for example, these sterile devices. So you can do exclusions from the standard. In general, though, you do have to comply with all the requirements that apply to you. So don't start just kind of deviating from everything. Then the next step would be to outline the structure of your QMS documentation. You always have to establish a quality manual. This is something the standard requires. And that will include the scope of your QMS, including the exclusions. And you always have to provide some kind of justification for the exclusions, especially if you want to get the certificate. Then you will establish company policies as part of the quality manual or as separate documents. Policies they're kind of statements. That's how I use them. They are statements of how we are thinking about applying to a specific set of requirements. And that's why I like to keep them in the quality manual rather than creating separate documents. For me, it doesn't make sense. So quality manual is kind of as said, it's a manual of how you do work from quality management system point of view. Then you will establish procedures as applicable to you and as required by the standard. So from applicable parts, you will create these procedures as the standard requires, taking into consideration any regulatory requirements that would affect those procedures. And of course, your own processes. Always consider how things are done now or how you want to do things, and then make sure that whatever you do, you also consider the requirements that come from the standard and from the regulations, and take those into your system, or take those kind of as part of the system, part of the procedure. Usually it's also helpful to establish these kind of a default templates and forms that are relevant for each procedure. And they will basically guide people to work according to the process or the procedure. So they will help them to document the information that is required, make sure that the evidence of the compliance with the procedures exists. And then establish work instructions as needed. For production, in case you are making physical products, there's always some production work instructions that are product specific, but you also can create work instructions that are specific to a part of procedures, such as requirement management in different systems, such as Atlassian, Jira, or Polarion systems, or something like that. Also, from document controls point of view, there are multiple systems that you can do your document controls in. So in case you don't want to describe these specifically in the procedure, you can always create a work instruction that will go into detail to the actual system. Basically, this is the #1 rule within any quality management system. Document what you do and do what you document. You might have the best system ever, the most beautiful quality management system, but if you don't do accordingly, it's basically no use, and you can never show the evidence of compliance. You will never get this certified. On the other hand, this kind of system, if it's not specific for you and you are trying to use it, it will also make your life really miserable. So this is where I always emphasize that you have to remember your own needs together and then combine those with the regulations and requirements. After you have then defined your scope and the documentation and so on, you will basically start using your system, using the documented procedures and instructions, and do that systematically in your daily operations. You have to apply the procedures as they are described and establish the documents or records according to the procedures. In case you do deviate from the procedures for any reason, you always have to remember to do that in a controlled fashion. For example, if for some reason in some specific design and development project anyway, you will deviate from example the design and development milestones or phases, you will describe those deviations in, for example, your project plan, very detailed manner, making sure that you still comply with the requirements that are required. You are required to comply with, but still it is okay. It's okay to deviate as long as you describe how, you describe why, and you are still able to show compliance with the requirements outside the system. Of course, if you always find yourself deviating from specific procedures, then just update the procedure. It's the intention of the QMS. It's a live system, so it needs to be updated, it needs to be maintained, it needs to be made better. But remember, if it's not documented, it does not exist. And that's why also these deviations is important that you document. So even though you've done everything accordingly, but you are missing some set of documentation, it doesn't help you to try and say, but yes, we did do that. Okay, nice. But I don't have the evidence, so I basically choose to believe that you didn't do it. And then you will face up some findings and non-conformities, and you will have to correct this thing. But as said, there's always something. Make sure that you do the things as well as you can, and everything should be fine. In general, then you just maintain and improve your QMS. Continuous improvement of the quality management system is a requirement, and it includes the use of information from both your internal sources, so your employees, maybe your some stakeholders, as well as external sources, meaning, for example, these regulation standards and guidance. You should definitely follow up the field, follow up the requirements, follow up the state of the art especially, and figure out a way to take into consideration any updated or new regulation standards and guidances. They will usually regulations changes in regulations, of course, are something that come from different kinds of needs maybe, but for standards and guidances, they are usually to kind of make things even more, for some reason, even easier, or try to give you more information on how to achieve the compliance or how to achieve certain procedures. Apply your internal process to acquire information from these sources, and use them as a source of change needed for your QMS. Also, kind of a new or modified customer requirements may affect your quality management system, depending on your role, depending on what you are doing. And here is an example actually done by me once upon a time. It's a table of content of a quality manual. I like to structure the manual in accordance with the standard. It just makes my life a lot easier. If I was a quality manager, for example, and as I were. So I will consider the quality management system requirements, management responsibility, and so on within chapters 4 to 8. In the beginning, I will talk about general things as well as the context of the organization. The interested parties come actually from ISO 9001, but the scope of the quality management system then discusses the role of the organization within the supply chain, as well as the exclusions. As I discussed, they definitely need to be stated. The references section I use to refer to the exact procedures. They have a specific unique ID. I refer to these procedures to describe how or where the actual process has been described. As I said, I do not want to document these procedures as part of the quality manual. I like to keep quality manuals as short as possible. So I rather refer to external documentation than always go and change the quality manual. And of course, nobody can read a huge documentation. Everybody will just stop in the beginning or somewhere in the middle. So it's better to have them as separate so people can concentrate on those procedures, for example, that are actually important to themselves. There's also, as an attachment at the end, there's a process map. And that is also something that you always have to define. You have to define the interrelationship between the procedures within your system. It can be more general level, or somebody might actually require it to be very specific and maybe refer to your specific process descriptions using the unique IDs, for example. These unique IDs are part of the document controls that we discussed previously. So, a word about the certification. Quality management system, you can certify your quality management system against ISO 13485, but it's not mandatory, at least not usually. Of course, as we learned today, Canadian market is an exception from that rule. The certification, of course, provides you some insurance of compliance so that you actually have understood things correctly. And of course, it gives you added credibility and helps you to ensure the authorities. Also, as we said, some regulatory authorities do require the certification. So it will just do this in advance will help you in the long run. And definitely, let's say that if you just state that you are ISO 13485 compliant, but not certified, it doesn't really mean anything. So of course, if you are confident and if this is something, especially for marketing, that you want to use, I always suggest just go through the certification. The certification process is conducted by an accredited certification body. And please notice this is different than, for example, a notified body in the EU, even though the persons doing the audit may be the same. The actual legal entity is different. So notified bodies do not certify quality management system against 13485, but they inspect the quality management system against the regulations. Anyway, it's a certificate. It's an accredited certification body, and the certification is done based on your own certification request. Very generalized certification audit lasts around 2 to 3 days. This depends on the scope and complexity of the QMS that they are inspecting and the size of the organization. Of course, it can be longer, usually not less than 2 days though. The first day would be online or kind of a online audit, and then the other day would be offline work. So I'd say that 2 days is definitely a minimum, maybe a day and a half, and it can be more depending how many, for example, factory sites you might have and want to certify. You can, so as I said, you can limit the scope of the certification to a certain factory or certain plant and leave the other one out if you have 2 sites. But of course, usually, especially if you do handle medical devices in both, you will certify both. I'm not going to go into details of the price, but let's say it's at least some thousands of euros. And I will leave that completely open. I'm not even trying to guess. I don't remember what it was last time. And it depends a lot, again, about the complexity. So it can be completely different to one company and to another. Audit concentrates on the QMS documentation, so your procedures, work instructions, as well as the evidence of compliance with this documentation. So you definitely, you should always wait with the certification until you have something to show. It makes no sense to start the certification before you start design and development of your product if design and development is part of your quality management system, because you will not be able to show the evidence of compliance with your system then. Of course, there's always something that kind of can be left out. For example, these activities that come after market access, you cannot show evidence of those until you have actually established or put your product on the market. And usually the certifications have been made before that already. So of course, some things are left out and they will get back to them to the following years. But the main parts of your system definitely need to be already in use and have evidence of use. After the audit, you will get an audit report that states the found non-conformities, and there will be non-conformities. I always say that if there is no non-conformities in the audit, the auditor hasn't done their work. Just because we are humans and humans make the mistakes, however hard we try. The non-conformities are either major or minor. The difference is that for major non-conformities, you have 90 days to correct the non-conformity. For minor non-conformities, you have 90 days to actually publish or give a plan how you will correct these non-conformities within a specified time frame that you have given. After you have corrected these non-conformities, you will receive the QMS certificate that will state the scope of your system and the date of the certificate. After you have got the certificate, and in case you want to maintain your certification, you will be audited annually. So the surveillance audit will be, the first surveillance audit will be conducted about 12 months after the first one, the certification, and the second surveillance audit, of course, in a third year. And every 3 years, they will do a new certification audit. So if you want to maintain your certificate, it will be invalid after 3 years, and you will have to go through the new certification audit. These certification audits are always a little bit longer than a surveillance audit, but mainly the same structure. So what did we learn today? Before we get to the questions, a very, very quick and short summary. The job isn't finished until the paperwork is done. So always remember to document, document, document. Whether it's in a system or whether it's PDF document, always remember to document the evidence. Thank you. So hopefully there are questions for me.
And yes, thank you very much, Linda. And there are actually quite a few questions, and I'm afraid we won't be able to take all of them. Okay. But I'll pick a few, and maybe hopefully you've already answered some of them, because some of them came at the beginning of your presentation. But let's start. One of the questions is, what are the most common pitfalls of the ISO 13485 process?
Pitfalls. I would say definitely not acknowledging the amount of work required. On a paper, it looks really simple. The requirements look really simple, but as I said, I think during the presentation, in order for you to be successful, you do need to put some effort into actual planning of the system, as well as using the system and maintaining the system. It is not a one-man job. Definitely, it's something that the whole company needs to be involved in, and definitely the management needs to be committed in.
Thank you. We have another question, and this specifically about the purchasing clause. And the question goes, does a distributor need to control the purchase of finished medical devices, or does the distributor provide a service to the manufacturer, and thus the manufacturer needs to control this service?
Of course, if you are a distributor who has or wants to certify the system, like now we are talking about the context of ISO 13485, of course, then you have to have and establish your own purchasing process. So if you want to certify your system, especially, or if the requirement is that you are compliant with 13485, from a regulatory point of view, basically the manufacturer is more, sorry, you said distributor, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh, I was talking about suppliers, but yeah, the first part is still there. From regulatory point of view, manufacturer is always the main responsible party. Distributor requirements are now a bit, they are like a newer part, but I think that for now I cannot, so now this is something that I would have to actually check from the regulation. But let's say that if there is not a specific requirement for a distributor to have a kind of a controlled purchasing process, which I think there is not, it is actually it goes to what the manufacturer and the distributor have agreed upon. So if the manufacturer requires you, for example, they have selected you based on their own purchasing project and they require you to have it, then it's between you two. If you have your own quality management system as a distributor, of course, then you have to have the compliant purchasing process there.
Okay, we have another question. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more. And it's kind of related to the first question about the pitfalls. And the question goes, what are the most common misconceptions related to ISO 13485 certification?
I'd say some organizations, first of all, tend to think that this is kind of a key to the happiness. Okay, we have the certification now, yay, everything's fine. This is not the case. Definitely not anymore when there's so much talk about different things. It is something, it opens doors still to, especially to healthcare sector, to healthcare companies. But it's not a guarantee, and this is maybe also for those who buy devices from manufacturers that have 13485, it is kind of not as such, it's not necessarily a guarantee of quality. So definitely I'd say that as a buyer, make sure you discuss, depending on your requirements and the kind of your own critical points, discuss them with the manufacturer, maybe do an audit, make sure that they actually do things as they should, because sometimes even though they have a certificate, there are deviations that come up sometimes or do not come up at all. And also as a manufacturer, that doesn't open every door. And as I said during the presentation, it's not enough for regulatory point of view. So you always have to think about larger scale than just the standard requirements.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question. You mentioned Canada specifically, and one of the question goes, does Canada require the same for IVD devices, ISO 13485 under MDSAP?
I'm now guessing. I've basically kind of IVD devices are medical devices. So all IVD devices are medical devices, but not all medical devices are IVD devices. So I'd say that yes, they do. This is again Canadian specific regulation and specific to their market. So you have to check that still, but I'm pretty confident saying that yes, they do. Of course, depending of the classification of the specific IVD device.
Okay, then we actually still have 3 more minutes before we have to wrap up. And as I mentioned earlier, there are quite a few questions. This question came in early, so maybe you have already answered that during the presentation, but let's give it a go. The question goes, are these extra standards a requirement? Does one have to show that they have them in their list of standards?
Standards are always not mandatory. Of course, they are recommended because, as I said, why would you make up the wheel again? They are the list that I provided is a very state of the art. It is what is expected, but they are not mandatory. You do not have to use them. For example, within the EU, you don't have to use any standards. Probably everybody is familiar with the context of harmonized standards. We don't have many yet against the regulation. We have had a nice list for the directive, but they are coming, and there is also the request is available, so you can see the exact versions that are now under the harmonization, or hopefully will get harmonized at some point. But I'd say that it's really difficult to survive without using those standards, because you still have to provide the evidence of the safety, of the performance of the device, and those are basically just providing you the answers already. So I'd say no, they are not mandatory, but it's really difficult to survive, especially the electronics part. It's really difficult to survive in the field without using the 60601 series.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. And
thank you.
Now we are actually running out of time, and it's time for me to wrap up. And on behalf of Medicon Valley Alliance, I would just like to say, hope to see you later. I hope and truly believe it's been a time well spent, and that you have appetite for more MVA events in the future, and perhaps also more Innocuous medical events. As mentioned earlier, feel free to reach out to me if you want to know anything about this and other MVA event concept. And of course, thank you very much to you, Linda, and to you, Eva, and Innocuous, who of course made this webinar possible. And I guess with that said, we have reached our destination, so to speak, and I will conclude this inspirational webinar. So take care out there.